Wine's eyes sparkled as she ran her fingers over the soft fabric of a delicate floral frock. She turned toward her friend, excitement evident in her voice. Ruby, look at this one. Isn't it adorable? Ruby stepped closer, her eyes scanning the dress before nodding with a smile. Oh, yes, it's beautiful. Wine held the dress against her body, admiring it with a dreamy smile. Jungkook likes these kinds of floral frocks. At that, Ruby's lips curved into a small smirk, as if she had just thought of something amusing. Oh, then maybe I should try it on. Wine's brows frowned slightly for a moment. Something about Ruby's words made her feel uneasy. Why would she want to try it on if Jungkook likes these types? But quickly she masked her expression with a small, forced smile. Oh, okay. Jungkook sat on a black leather couch nearby, his fingers idly scrolling through his phone, completely uninterested in their conversation. His cold indifference was something Wine had long grown used to. While Wine continued browsing through dresses, Ruby disappeared into the changing room. A few moments later, she stepped out, twirling in the tipping floral frock with delicate flower prints. Jungkook, look at this. How do I look? She spun in front of him, her dress flaring slightly as she grinned. There was an undeniable eagerness in her voice, as if she was seeking his approval. Jungkook barely lifted his gaze. His eyes flickered toward her for a moment before he looked back at his phone, completely unimpressed and silent. Wine, who had been observing the scene from a distance, felt a strange discomfort settle in her chest. Why did she always try to get his attention? She wondered, but almost immediately she shook her head, scolding herself. No, Wine, don't think negatively. Ruby is my friend. I should trust her. Determined to push away her thoughts, she forced a smile and walked toward Ruby. However, the moment Ruby noticed Wine approaching, she quickly straightened up and hurriedly stepped closer to her as if she didn't want Wine near Cho. Wine, isn't this dress perfect for me? She giggled softly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear in a shy manner. Wine's brows knitted together briefly before she quickly masked her expression. Oh, yes, it looks like it was made just for you. Ruby smiled, her eyes darting toward Jungkook again, almost as if she was silently waiting for his reaction. But he remained as cold as ever. Still scrolling through his phone, Jungkook suddenly spoke, his deep voice breaking through the air. Are you both done? Wine opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Ruby cut in excitedly. Oh, yes, but I also want a wallet. Jungkook exhaled tiredly, rubbing his temples before leaning back against the couch. Just tell me when you are finally done. Without missing a beat, Ruby grabbed Wine's wrist and pulled her toward the handbag section, completely unfazed by Jungkook's cold attitude. As Ruby busied herself looking at wallets, Wine couldn't help but observe her closely. Why do I feel like she's always trying to get close to Jungkook? Is it just my imagination, or is there really something off? Wine let out a soft sigh, shaking her thoughts away, but deep inside, a seed of doubt had already been planted. After finishing their shopping, the three of them walked toward Jungkook's sleek black car parked near the entrance. Wine instinctively headed toward the passenger seat, but before she could reach for the door handle, Ruby suddenly rushed past her. I will sit here, she jerked excitedly, opening the door and sliding into the passenger seat without a second thought. Wine paused for a second, her hand hovering mid-air before she clenched her fingers. A subtle wave of disappointment washed over her, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to ignore the growing irritation in her chest. Without a word, she walked around and settled into the back seat. Jungkook, already seated behind the wheel, tightened his grip on it, his jaw clenching slightly. His mood had already been off the moment Ruby invited herself along. What annoyed him more was how she constantly tried to act close to him. Flirty, even. He never encouraged it, yet she never seemed to get the message. As he started the car, Ruby began chatting nonstop, her voice filling the silence. Jungkook, you should have seen the way the shopkeeper looked at us when we bought so many things. It was hilarious. Oh, and that pink purse? I was so close to buying it, but then I saw this cream one and I was like, her words blurred into the background as Jungkook barely acknowledged her, nodding absent-mindedly once or twice. His focus, however, wasn't on the road, it was on wine. From the rearview mirror, he kept glancing at her, her arms folded, gaze fixed outside the window, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't sulking, nor was she complaining, but the way she avoided his eyes made something twist in his chest. He didn't know how to express his emotions, but he hated seeing her like this. She wanted to sit in the front. She wanted to be with me, but she let her take her place. His grip on the wheel tightened slightly. He didn't like Ruby in the first place, and he liked it even less when she inserted herself between him and wine. The drive felt suffocating, at least for him. The moment Ruby stepped out, Jungkook barely waited for her to close the door before he drove off. The air inside the car instantly felt lighter without her presence. Wine, however, remained in the back seat. Jungkook glanced at her through the mirror before speaking. Come, sit here. Wine's eyes flickered toward him, but she shook her head slightly. I'm okay. His jaw clenched. I didn't like repeating myself. Letting out a quiet sigh, Wine hesitated before finally shifting to the front seat. Fastening her seatbelt, the car ride resumed in silence, but Jungkook's patience was wearing thin. Now, what did I do? He asked, his tone sharp but not harsh. Wine didn't respond, staring at the outside of the window. I told you already, she's just trying to get close to me. Wine sighed, closing her eyes briefly. Please don't accuse her. I know she's not like that. Jungkook let out a deep breath, shaking his head. You never listened to me at first, but later you realized I was right. Wine didn't argue. She didn't say anything at all. Jungkook glanced at her from the corner of his eye. He knew she trusted Ruby. He also knew why. Back in college, Wine wasn't financially strong, and Ruby had always been there for her, helping her, supporting her, even forcing Wine to accept things she didn't want to take. There were days when Wine was bullied and Ruby defended her. Because of that, Wine never wanted to hurt her, never wanted to question her intentions, but Ruby wasn't the same girl anymore, and Wine didn't see it yet. Jungkook tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, swallowing his frustration. He wanted to tell Wine the truth, to make her see what he saw, but she wasn't ready to hear it. So for now, he kept his mouth shut, but one day she would know. One day she would see that what kind of person Ruby truly was. After a week, the soft glow of fairy lights illuminated the grand living room as guests mingled, laughter and chatter filling the space. It was Wine's birthday, yet her mind felt restless. Jungkook stood near the grand piano, his sharp gaze occasionally flickering toward her. The door creaked open, drawing Wine's attention. Ruby. She strutted inside, her dress clinging to her frame, a deep red with a dangerously high slit that left little to the imagination. The moment she stepped in, her eyes locked onto Jungkook. Wine's fingers twitched at her sides. Something about Ruby's demeanor felt off. Jungkook, she cooed, her voice honeyed as she made her way toward him. Jungkook barely spared her a glance, sipping his drink with a sigh. What do you want? Why so cold? I just came to see you. Wine's stomach churned, watching the scene unfold. Ruby moved closer, standing right beside him, her fingers subtly brushing against his arm. You are looking so handsome tonight, just like always. Jungkook's expression darkened as he took a step back, clearly uncomfortable. Step back. Ruby let out a soft chuckle, ignoring his warning. Jungkook, why don't you see me the way I see you? Then she took a deep breath and sighed it. I love you. The air in the room shifted. Wine felt her heart stop. Jungkook's eyes snapped toward Ruby, his grip tightening around his glass before he set it down with force. His entire posture screamed irritation. What did you just say? Ruby stepped even closer, her hand daring to reach for his. Jungkook, I have loved you for so long. You deserve someone like me, not. She threw a glance at Wine, her voice dripping with disdain. Her, Wine's breath hitched. Jungkook clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. Stay away from me, Ruby. His words were sharp, leaving no room for misinterpretation. But Ruby wasn't done. Why? Why her, Jungkook? She's nothing compared to me. I can give you everything. Why are you wasting yourself on her? Wine felt her chest tighten, her lips trembled slightly as she took slow steps forward. Ruby was so catch up in her delusions that she didn't even notice Wine approaching. She should be grateful I was even friends with her. Wine's feet halted. I gave her everything. I helped her when she had nothing, and she can't even sacrifice this one thing for me. Just give him to me. A sharp slap echoed through the room. Ruby gasped, stumbling back as her hand flew to her cheek, her eyes wide in disbelief. Wine stood before her, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Her own hand still tingling from the impact, her usually gentle eyes were ablaze with a storm of emotions. First of all, he's not a thing. Ruby's lips parted, but Wine wasn't done. And second, don't you dare act like your so called kindness was out of love. You helped me, but that doesn't mean you own me or my life. Ruby let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting toward Jungkook in desperation. Please just give him to me, Wine. Why's lips quivered, but she didn't speak. You don't deserve him, you never did. A thick silence filled the space. Jungkook suddenly stepped forward, his presence overwhelming as he towered over Ruby. His gaze was filled with nothing but disgust. I was never yours to have, Ruby. His voice was low, menacing. Get out before I throw you out. Ruby swallowed hard, her pride shattering as she turned on her heel and stormed out of the house. The door slammed shut. Wine stood frozen, staring at the floor. Her heart was heavy, but more than anything, she felt betrayed. Then a warm hand wrapped around hers. She looked up, startled. His grip was firm yet gentle. He didn't say a word, but in that moment, she realized she didn't need him to. The house was finally silent. After the heated confrontation, the guests had all left, leaving behind only an eerie stillness. The dim lights cast soft shadows on the walls, making the once lively space feel empty. Wine stood frozen near the couch, her arms wrapped around herself. The warmth of the celebration had vanished, replaced by a deep, hollow ache. Jungkook, who had been standing near the door, locked it before turning toward her. His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable as he observed her. Her small, trembling frame, the way her lips pressed into a thin line, and the way her fingers clenched the fabric of her dress. She was trying to hold it together. With the quiet sigh, Jungkook stepped forward. Sit down. Wine didn't respond. She just stood there, lost in her thoughts. A muscle in Jungkook's jaw twitched. He hated seeing her like this, so fragile, so hurt. Without another word, he reached out, his fingers gently wrapping around her waist. His touch was firm yet careful as he pulled her toward the couch, making her sit. Jungkook, he ignored the way his heart clenched at the way she said his name, so broken, so uncertain. Instead, he crouched in front of her. His intense gaze locked onto hers. A single tear slipped down Wine's cheek. Without thinking, Jungkook raised his hand, his thumb brushing against her skin, wiping it away. His touch was rough, close, yet inexplicably gentle. Crying over people like her isn't worth it. Wyan let out a shaky breath. She wasn't always like this. Jungkook didn't speak, letting her continue. She looked down at her lap, fingers forgetting. In college, I wasn't strong, Jungkook. I was. She hesitated, swallowing hard. I was bullied. Jungkook's expression hardened. His grip on his knee tightened, but he remained silent. I wasn't rich. I didn't have designer clothes or expensive things. The other students, they made sure I knew that. She let out a bitter laugh. Shaking her head, Ruby was the one who stood by me. She helped me when no one else did. She bought me things even when I didn't want her to. She defended me. Her voice cracked at the last sentence. Jungkook's fingers twitched. So, how was I supposed to believe she would ever betray me? How was I supposed to see her as the bad person when she was the only good thing I had back then? Jungkook exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tightening. You trusted too easily. While laughed weakly, wiping her nose. Maybe I did. A silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock. Then White suddenly let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the hem of her dress tightly. I don't even know what's real anymore. I trusted her. I trusted our friendship. I thought she was my family, Jungkook. Her eyes were glassy as she looked at him. Was I just stupid? Jungkook's chest tightened. Before she could even react, he moved. He shrugged off his jacket and placed it over her shoulders. The warmth of his body heat still lingering in the fabric. Wine looked up at him, startled. No, you were not. She blinked. You just cared too much for the wrong person. Clenching his jaw, looking away slightly. Wine bit her lip, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Then, as if all the emotions she had been holding in finally became too much, she broke. Her shoulders shook as she buried her face in her hands. Her soft sobs filled the empty room, muffled by her palms. Jungkook watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. And then, without thinking, he did something he never thought he would. He reached forward and wrapped his arms around her. It wasn't tight, it wasn't forceful, but it was there. Solid, warm, steady. Wine froze. Jungkook didn't say a word. He just let her cry into his chest, his fingers hesitantly running through her hair in an awkward yet strangely comforting gesture. It was the first time he had ever held her like this, the first time he had let her break in front of him, and for the first time in a long time, Wine didn't feel alone. Jungkook stood up, adjusting his sword before extending his hand toward Wine. Come with me. Wine looked up at him, her eyes still glossy from the tears that had yet to stop falling. She hesitated. Where? He didn't answer. He simply grabbed her wrist and gently pulled her up. Wine followed him, her feet moving on their own as he led her to the dining area. There, in the soft glow of candlelight, a small yet beautifully decorated cake sat on the table. A single candle flickered in the center. Wine's lips parted slightly in surprise. She hadn't expected this. Jungkook pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. Sit. She did as he sat, swallowing hard as she wiped the lingering tears from her cheeks. Jungkook took a seat across from her, his intense gaze never leaving her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jungkook reached toward, grabbing the knife and placing it in her hand. Make a wish. Wine blinked at him, her fingers tightening around the knife. She bit her lip, her heart feeling heavier than before. A wish she had so many. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting out a shaky breath. Please just let someone truly stay by my side. She slowly opened her eyes and cut the cake. Jungkook watched her closely, his lips twitching slightly as if he wanted to say something but chose not. Instead, he took a small piece of the cake and held it up to her. Eat. One hesitated but leaned forward, taking a small bite. Jungkook nodded approvingly before cutting a piece for himself and eating it as well. But even as she chewed, Wine's tears still didn't stop. Jungkook noticed he frowned slightly, setting his fork down. You are still crying. Wine quickly wiped her cheeks, shaking her head. I'm fine. Jungkook scoffed. Yeah, you look like a lost kitten that just got kicked into the rain. Wine pouted slightly, glaring at him. That's rude. Jungkook smirked slightly, leaning his chin on his hand as he watched her. Well, am I wrong? One bite the inside of her cheek, fighting back a smile. She hated that he was always like this, cold, teasing, mysterious. But somehow it was comforting. Jungkook leaned forward again, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. What did you wish for? Wine's breath caught in her throat. She looked down, playing with the edge of her sleeve. Nothing. Jungkook wasn't convinced. He tilted his head, staring her. You hesitated before cutting the cake. That means it was something important. Wine pursed her lips, refusing to answer. Jungkook sighed, shaking his head. Fine, keep your little secret. Then suddenly he reached over and swiped a bit of frosting onto his finger. Before Wine could react, he flicked it onto her nose. Her eyes widened in shock. Jungkook Jungkook leaned back, smirking. Oops. Wine narrowed her eyes, grabbing a bit of frosting on her own finger. You started this. Before he could dodge, she smeared the frosting on his cheek. Jungkook froze for a second, his eyes widening slightly in disbelief. Then he let out a soft chuckle. Not a sarcastic one, not a mocking one, but a genuine one. Wine's breath hissed. She had never heard him laugh like that before. Jungkook shook his head, still smirking as he wiped his cheek. I should have expected that from my little troublemaker. Wine blinked, her cheeks flushed at his words, her heart fluttering in an unfamiliar way. For the first time that night, her tears stopped falling. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled. He had gifted her a delicate pendant earlier. His words cold as always, but his actions, choosing the exact piece of jewelry she had once admired, spoke louder than words.